It can't be that bad, I said. In the fall of 1982, we had finally moved to a permanent apartment in the village of Ipswich, Massachusetts, in my second year in seminary. It was a little bit of a quirky apartment. It was a doctor's office, but the rent was really reasonable. It was above a restaurant. In fact, when we took the apartment, my wife, who always was the cautious one, said, "You know, I'm not so sure I want to be above a restaurant because sometimes you have fires in the restaurant." As I looked at her and said, "I don't think you need to worry about that." Well, in the fall of that year, right around the 1st of November, one morning, as I finished taking a shower, I happened to notice that in the building behind where we were, flames were shooting up. And all of a sudden, we realized we were in the midst of a horrible fire. Luckily, we were dressed, and we got Mary up. She was only 2 years old at the time. We got out of the building, didn't really take anything. 12 fire companies from the North Shore of Massachusetts went to put out the fire. It went for the whole block in the village of Ipswich. Afterwards, we went about our business that day. There was nothing else we could do. And eventually, I didn't even take my car keys. I got my car keys and was able to go where I needed to go. And for a few days there, I drove past the apartment, looking up in the window and seeing books still on the shelf, and said to myself, it can't be that bad. All that changed when one of the fire captains asked me to come and go into the apartment to get a few things. For indeed, there was some severe damage done. We did get a few things only after walking in about 6 inches of water from all the water the fire companies had put in the apartment. Everything was pretty well water-soaked, but we did happen to get some things out. The bottom line was, my first assessment, it wasn't that bad. It was really that bad. And that afternoon, by myself, we were staying at a professor's house. They all went out. I simply wept that day. For 6 years of our life had just literally been completely disrupted, and it would never be the same again. It was that bad. In the history of the people of Israel, God knew that there would be a time of destruction. And the prophets spoke about that destruction. And interestingly enough, for many, many years, almost up to the end, if you read the Old Testament prophets, people had that word, it can't be that bad. God is not going to abandon God's people. God's not going to destroy utterly, as these prophets have predicted. But we know the story. It was that bad. How disheartening it must have been to see the temple destroyed, the walls of the city torn down. Indeed, as one of the prophets said, the very glory of God rose up from the temple and left the city of Jerusalem. The best and the brightest taken away. It was that bad. It was a complete destruction of a land that people had loved and were proud of because they felt that God was in their midst, and it was gone. Even though they were warned, even though the might of Babylon had destroyed elsewhere, it was that bad. And finally it sinks in, and indeed you hear it in Psalm 139 especially, by the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept. But as we go on with the prophets and Ezekiel, whose best kind of prophecy was what we like to call an enactment prophecy, actually acting out something. He says he's by the river with some exiles. So he is not in his land, and those people there are away from their land as well. And God transports him to a place where there are all sorts of dried out, bleached white bones laying around. Now, for you and I, that might sound a little bit unusual, but keep in mind that when armies fought back in ancient days, they did not have artillery or sophisticated weapons. They just went man to man in combat in huge numbers. And so to see those bones on that dried out desert floor, it would not be an unusual sight to see. So God looks at Ezekiel and says, "Can these bones live?" Ezekiel, ever the prophet and ever the servant of the Lord, hands it back to God and says, "Only you know." And the story goes from there. And perhaps you think about that old spiritual, those dry bones, and they come together and they become with flesh, and then eventually by the Spirit of God, the breath of God, they become a mighty army, a host. And God says to Ezekiel, "Right now, my people feel like those bones. Their hope is lost. It's gone. But I'm going to take them from their graves. I'm going to raise them up and put them in their land." And I imagine as Ezekiel saw that vision and he recounted it to people. And keep in mind that when those visions were there, this did not happen instantaneously. They were in the midst of their exile. They were in the midst of the destruction and the terrible things that happened to them. That to hear that vision was a vision of hope. Not a vision of completion, but a vision of hope in the midst of despair. And it was a word for them not to completely give up. That no matter how bad it seemed to be, that at the end of the day, God was not in the destruction business, but he was in the renewal business. And indeed, we see this in the gospel lesson this morning as Jesus raises Lazarus. It is a symbol, as John uses his gospel, of God's power. That indeed, even in the worst circumstances, I am the resurrection and the life. We live right now in a time when things seem to be going from bad to worse with this pandemic. What does it mean to have hope in the midst of this time? Back to the fire. As we started sorting out our lives again, my daughter, 2 years old at the time, the one thing she cried about was her favorite blanket, her Raggedy Ann blanket. "I want Raggedy Ann," and somebody tried to find some material and that would not take the place of that Raggedy Ann blanket. Well, when we did go and get some things from the apartment, there it was in horrible condition in her room. We picked it up, and I remember taking Mary with me to the laundromat with that blanket. And when I went to the laundromat, I took maybe about 3 or 4 of those boxes you spend about $1 for of laundry and just threw it in the machine, making sure I had 2 or 3 different fabric. When it came time to dry it, 2 or 3 different fabric softener sheets. It went through the cycle quite completely. It came out, and there it was. She had it back again. And there she was, contented, holding on to her blanket. We were still in flux. In fact, we did not really have our own place until about a year later, really. But that blanket was a symbol of hope. And when we moved here, it's a little bit torn at the edges, but a Raggedy Ann blanket, we gave it to her this year. No, it wasn't the fact that we had everything restored to us. That took a while. No, we weren't over the shock of what had happened, but this Raggedy Ann blanket was a symbol of hope, of going forward. We don't know where tomorrow is going to bring. We never know. And we are in probably the greatest uncertainty of our lives. But my prayer is for you and myself that God would give us those little things, that vision of hope, just as the prophets gave a vision to those who were despairing. And that as those signs of hope that God plants within us, even if they're small, not as dramatic as Jesus and Lazarus, but that indeed we have that vision to go forward. The old King James Version of Proverbs says, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." May God grant you and I a vision of hope, that as the old hymn goes, "Heart of my own heart, whate'er befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all." Let us pray together. Lord, as we are together this time, as we hear your word, we admit we live in perhaps the most challenging and difficult time for all of us, wherever we are. Indeed, our lives have been completely changed, disrupted. We don't know what the future is going to bring. We trust in you, Lord, and we ask that as we continue to go on, help us to see those signs, those visions, those things that continue to give us hope, that we might go forward. And we thank you, O Lord, that even in the midst of what we walk through, that you are not in the destruction business, that you are not to push us down, but rather that you are in the renewal business, as you said to Mary, "I am the resurrection and the life." We do not know how that works out, Lord, or we don't know what it will look like, but help us to trust you for it. For indeed, you are the resurrection and life. Give us that vision of hope that we may not despair. Amen.